In today's video, we're taking a look at some NHL trade rumors concerning the recently eliminated Carolina Hurricanes. Could they turn to another playoff team like New Jersey or Toronto to try to pull off a blockbuster trade? Plus, some of the Coyotes players are getting considerable interest from other NHL teams. We've seen the Dallas Stars survive last night and push into a Game 5 with the Vegas Golden Knights. The Memorial Cup's ready to start, and we have an update as well on the Maple Leafs GM search and Kyle Dubas' investigation. All that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a lot to cover today. First up, I want to talk about the Dallas Stars and their incredible win last night against the Vegas Golden Knights to force a Game 5 and avoid a sweep. So we're not going to have sweeps in both of our conference finals here in the NHL Stanley Cup playoffs. Of course, we know the Florida Panthers was able to get through Carolina, and even though they swept them 4-0, it really did not feel like a sweep. They were all incredibly close, one-goal games, many of which went to overtime. Could have went either direction. In all honesty, Sergei Bobrovsky outplayed Frederik Andersen, but Frederik Andersen was incredible too. The difference was not overly drastic, and I know Rod Brind'Amour got a lot of criticism for his comments after they lost after Game 4, saying that he was there and he's seen it and they didn't get swept, they didn't lose 4 straight. But I think what he's trying to say is, obviously it's a poor choice of words, and the way he came out certainly sounded really weird. I get all that, but what he's trying to say is essentially those games were incredibly close. He feels like they were right there, could have went either way, and it did not feel like a sweep, even though it was. Well, it was starting to feel the same way on the other side, but it was a little bit, I wouldn't call it more lopsided, but I think Vegas had a more of an edge than we've seen over Dallas than Florida did over Carolina. At least it felt that way for me when I was watching the games. But last night we saw a nice bounce back from Dallas. Jake Ottinger did look a little bit shaky early on, but then found a groove and was good the rest of the way. Vegas again scored an early first period goal, which has been a trend in that series, but Dallas was able to recoup and get back together. Jason Robertson, I thought, was phenomenal. Of course, Joe Pavelski came up big with the overtime game-winning goal. We saw a penalty call late, which gave Dallas an opportunity there. That was a high-sticking penalty. It was a little different than the case of the Hurricanes getting called for tripping in the offensive zone at that. A call that you really can't avoid making when the stick came up right to the face. But anyway, Dallas holds on and survives. We will have hockey on Saturday night, which is fantastic. Depending on if the game goes in the favor of Vegas or Dallas will determine when the Stanley Cup Final starts. At this point, the earliest possible game for Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final will be May 31st. Now on to another important tournament. The Memorial Cup kicks off this evening. Of course, the Memorial Cup is the pinnacle of junior hockey in Canada, the crown a national champion. We know that all 3 leagues that fall under the CHL umbrella have gone through their playoffs and determined the league champions. And then, of course, there's always a host team as well to wrap up the 4-team tournament. Now, we'll get started today to determine the national championship. Now, of course, we have the Quebec Ramparts, the Quebec League champions today, getting the things kicked off against the host team, Kamloops Blazers, out in BC. Of course, the other 2 teams in the tournament are the Peterborough Petes representing the OHL, and of course, the Seattle Thunderbirds representing the Western Hockey League. So it should be a great tournament. If you haven't seen it before, you haven't watched it before, I know in Canada it's broadcast on TSN. I'm not sure if there's any coverage in the U.S. or not. Probably some highlights and stuff through NHL Network. I don't know if there's going to be any other coverage that way, but certainly a terrific tournament. I highly recommend you check it out. Lots of up-and-coming young NHL superstars on the rise, and some names you'll see in the upcoming draft as well taking part in that tournament. Now, as far as the Toronto Maple Leafs GM search, of course, lots have been talked about in that regard. Elliotte Friedman and Jeff Marek have a new episode of the 32 Thoughts podcast that was released earlier today. Elliotte, as well as Frank Cervelli, also put some stuff out on Twitter earlier. Between Frank and Elliotte, they have an updated list here on candidates that have either been already interviewed or believed to be interviewing here soon and will be in the mix. We've talked before and at length about former Flames GM Brad Treliving being in the mix there and maybe considered the front runner by many. I don't know that that's a complete fair statement and slam dunk that it's going to be Treliving that gets the job, but I do think that he seems to be highly considered for sure, and it wouldn't shock me if it turns out to be him. But some other names that might be a little bit more surprising would be like Peter Chiarelli. Chiarelli, of course, former GM in Boston and Edmonton. I'm a little bit surprised, to be honest, that his name is on this list. I don't think he did a good job at all in Edmonton. Decent job in Boston, but I'm not sure that he should have as much credit as he received there. But, at the end of the day, I'm a little surprised by him. Jason Botterill, apparently on this list as well. Of course, Botterill, current assistant GM in Seattle, former GM in Buffalo. Things in Buffalo didn't go the greatest, but I think there's a lot of other things that were at play there that was certainly against Botterill. But I think based on what I've seen and heard around the league, it does seem like he will likely get a second chance to be a GM at some point. He's also in the mix in Pittsburgh, depending on what happens with Dubas, which will be a big factor in all of this as well. And former Habs GM Mark Bergevin also in the mix. Now, Mark Bergevin to me is a very interesting candidate here. Now, a couple of things. One, I think it would be a different structure, him working under Brendan Shanahan and the board of directors at MLSE. Certainly in Montreal, he was, a direct connection to the owner, Jeff Molson. So he didn't have that many layers above him like he would have in Toronto. So different structure. So I don't know if he'd be obviously, totally, okay with that. Obviously he must be if he's being interviewed. One thing though is he is used to working in a very scrutinized hockey market in Canada. We know that the Canadian markets and the Canadian fan base are, a little crazy at times, and the Canadian teams certainly do get probably more media and a lot more scrutinizing than a lot of teams that sometimes fly under the radar in the United States. So Bergevin is certainly used to that pressure of a hockey hotbed, so I don't think that would be something that would be a big adjustment for him. He's used to dealing with the media plenty. So from that respect, good. Now, Mark Bergevin is also, as we've seen during his tenure with Montreal, not afraid to swing big moves. Now, you can say what you want about Mark Bergevin. I know there's probably some league fans who may not be too crazy with the former Habs GM being on this list and being, one of the contenders here. But at the end of the day, a lot of GMs, if you really scrutinize what they've done and all the trades and signings they've made over their tenure, I'm sure that there's most of them, if not all, that you could pick apart and focus on a handful of transactions to bring them down and say they didn't do a good job. But at the end of the day, Mark Bergevin was a GM in Montreal for a long time, and I think at the end of the day, he did do a lot of good things. I mean, like I said, I'm sure some things we could pick apart and scrutinize, but especially in my opinion, the last few years that he was there before he was let go, the team obviously struggled and it was time for a change. But he did do a lot of good things, and it wouldn't be shocking if he ended up there. And I do suggest Toronto fans maybe kind of try to become a little bit lukewarm to him, maybe being in the mix there. Because I would say, besides Tree Living, I would think Bergevin might be like the next best odds of getting this job. And it'd be really interesting to see, because you don't usually see a lot of changing between teams like Montreal and Toronto. But interesting indeed. Now, speaking of Kyle Dubas, of course, like I mentioned, the Jason Botterill candidacy for GM bids around a few of these teams will be dependent on Dubas, because Botterill was one of the front runners for the Pittsburgh job. And of course, they kind of put everything on hold when Dubas was let go by the Leafs and became available, and they're undergoing talks. Word is now for Elliotte Friedman that Fenway Group, who owns the Penguins, is going to give Dubas probably the weekend. It's a long weekend coming up in the U.S., Memorial Day weekend. Apparently, many of their the Fenway Group people are away at an F1 race, so I think it's in Monaco, I believe it is. So they're going to probably come back after the weekend and try to get this finalized, is what he was saying. So Dubas probably has a few more days to kind of make a decision here. I believe guys like Jason Botterill, and I think even Matthew Darsh and maybe one other guy was one of the names that were still kind of hanging around in the mix in Pittsburgh before Dubas became available. So we'll see what happens on that. I mean, all indications are it's his job if he wants it. When it comes to the Dubas investigation that I talked about on the channel in the last 24 to 36 hours here, Elliotte Friedman did touch on that in the 32 Thoughts podcast today as well, and his take on it is this. Even though the NHLPA is conducting a full investigation and review of the agent that's going to be or was representing Dubas in that whole situation, he's looked into it and he's kind of said, okay, well, what happens in other sports? And what's common here? Because we know that coaches and many sports executives use agents to negotiate their contract. They quite often don't do it themselves. So what is commonplace in other professional sports? So he did some digging, looking through like the NBA, Major League Baseball, the NFL. And from what he could find, now he couldn't find one in all of those sports, but he found a few situations that it seemed like it was similar situations where agents were representing executives, but not players, but working for the same agency that do represent players, like Wasserman, for example. And those leagues seem to be okay with it, and there's never been any issues brought up about it being a conflict of interest. So clearly, in Elliott's opinion, it's not a conflict of interest, and he doesn't think anything is going to come from this. However, regardless of that, I mean, that's his opinion. He might be right. We'll have to wait and see. But he did say that there are several agents that don't like this and want to see it changed. And I know, like I talked about yesterday as well, just to touch on in case you missed yesterday's video, there were some people that thought maybe it's a conspiracy from the Leafs trying to ruin Dubas. Maybe after going through negotiations with him and knowing who his rep was, and it was the same agency that represents Austin Matthews, maybe after they parted ways, they decided to put forth complaints, and that doesn't appear to be the case at all. The complaints and concerns are coming from other NHL agents that represent other players that think it's a conflict and don't like the idea of it. So we'll see if the NHLPA does anything with this. They're looking into it, and I don't know that really, even if they do determine that it wasn't a great idea, at this point, nothing's really happened. I don't see any punishments coming from it per se. So I'm not sure that there's really going to be a big outcome, but we'll have to wait and see when they find out. Now, on to a couple other trade talk here. A couple items I want to touch on. One, Freeman mentions that there's obviously, which we already kind of heard about before, but Coyotes players are getting a lot of attention for a couple of reasons. We know the Arizona Coyotes and their whole arena situation is very much in flux. We don't know what's happening. We know the Tempe bid failed. They're looking into other options. They're going to play at Mullet Arena this year. And because of the fact that there's currently no plan and uncertainty and just several questions about how this is going to work on a longer-term basis, there were reports that several Coyotes players were unhappy, upset, just confused and wanted clarity on what this is all going to happen. And it sounds like, I know Clayton Keller was at the forefront of that, especially with his dad taking to social media and putting forth a complaint saying he wasn't going to be there at training camp and all that. And we'll have to see what happens, but it's believed that after they talked about it and had official meetings, that they're going to give them about a month. So basically, it sounds like the time that free agency happens is when a lot of these players really want to know more and have more of a concrete agenda on how things are going to go. But obviously, Clayton Keller's not the only name out there that teams are monitoring and certainly showing interest in, but Lawson Crouse is another name that Coyotes are getting a lot of interest on. Obviously, Lawson Crouse is kind of at the point in his career where he should be just entering his prime years, proven pretty reliable, middle six type of forwards. In some cases, he could probably play top line depending on the role you give him, but he's certainly he's developed into a nice player and getting good attention. He's currently over at the World Championships playing for Team Canada. He's been playing well. I know I've seen a bunch of those games, and certainly lots to like about what Crouse can bring to the table for sure, especially when you see this year's playoffs. And that's the NHL's a copycat league. You see a team like Florida playing with a heavy forward check and just running guys over. Look at the Sam Bennett hit on Jacob Slavin the other night in the Florida-Carolina game, things like that. You want a player who can play rough, physical style, and you need guys, and Crouse could certainly play to that kind of category, no doubt. So getting lots of attention. So we'll have to wait and see. There's no teams directly linked to him. I know all we've heard is that there's lots of interest, and the Coyotes are certainly getting lots of calls. It's kind of, I think, probably putting bugs in their ear saying, well, if you consider trading this guy, what do you think you might want, just for teams to kind of get an outlook here. But certainly as we get closer to the draft and free agency, like I said, some of these players are going to want more clarity from the team. If they don't get it, they may request trades. But even if they do, we've seen how patient Bill Armstrong can be. Look how long the Jacob Chychrun trade drug out for the better part of a year plus before he was finally moved. I don't think he feels compelled to move anybody just because they're frustrated with the process or want things. I mean, I don't know if we'll get to a point if anybody will hold out in training camp or not report. I don't know. We'll see. But it's going to be interesting to watch in the Coyote situation in more ways than one as we try to get things figured out and see what the long-term future of the team is. Can it stay in Arizona, and which players are going to remain playing in Mullet Arena for one more year at the very least? Now, there's been lots of talk about the recently eliminated Carolina Hurricanes. This team has been incredibly successful in the regular season, just like some other teams we've seen, like, for example, the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Maple Leafs have had incredible runs in the regular season on a similar kind of time span. The Hurricanes have been really having success and have been good for a similar time frame, but they've never been able to get over the hump in round 3. Now, different scenario. The Leafs took forever to get past round 1. Carolina's had situations where they've lost in round 2, round 3, round 1 on occasion as well. but they've never won a game in round 3 where they've made it there multiple times. They've made I think they're 0-12 in Eastern Conference final games in recent history here, which is not good. And typically in the past, it's boiled down to the fact that when it mattered most in the biggest game of the year, they couldn't score. And that is still, I think, fair to say, a bit of an issue. Now, of course, with the goalie they were playing this year, and Sergei Bobrovsky, I do really wonder how much of a difference it would have made, because he was such a ridiculous run that he's been on. Would it have mattered? We'll never know, of course, because we can't go back in history and change things. But at the end of the day here, I have no doubt, based on what we've seen in the past with this team, what they've tried to do for moves, and what's speculated now, that they're going to be in store to make an attempt to make another blockbuster trade this offseason. The Hurricanes have been in the mix on just about a lot of the top players that we've seen move in the last couple of years, but they've rarely been on the outcome where they've landed the guy. They did get Brent Burns, for example. They made a Max Pacioretty trade, although I wouldn't call the Pacioretty one a blockbuster. But they did get him for nothing from Vegas, which was an incredibly smart move. It's just really unfortunate how things have played out with his health and the Achilles tear. Obviously, that's not something they could have foreseen coming. They did pull off the Brent Burns trade, of course, like I said, which has worked out quite nicely for them as well. But they've been in the mix for a lot of other big moves in the last, 2 years for sure, and even go back further, even more than that. Now, you look at the last couple of years, when it came to Timo Meier in San Jose this past year, they were all over that, one of the contenders right down to the wire. They tried to get him. They failed. They did not. They fell short. He went to New Jersey. Matthew Tkachuk, who just eliminated them in the Stanley Cup Eastern Conference Final for the Florida Panthers. When he was traded, the Hurricanes were probably the second closest team, besides Florida, to making that trade. Matthew Tkachuk was really close to being a Hurricane. It was boiled down to the Hurricanes and the Panthers from what we've heard. The Panthers, I think between, where Tkachuk wanted to sign and the offer to Calgary being a little better, got the deal done. Obviously, Carolina missed out on Matthew Tkachuk. There was rumors a few years ago that they were trying in the offer sheet game. This is before they ever had the tit-for-tat situation with Montreal in the offer sheet game when it came to Kotkaniemi and Sebastian Aho, when all that went down, that they were engaged with the Leafs, even trying to see if they could pry away like a Marner or a Nylander after the Leafs had, playoff blunders. And of course, that didn't happen either. So at the end of the day, Carolina has been linked to a lot of players, and a lot of it has been legit truth that these teams were talking and they've tried. They just failed. Now, in this playoffs, they were also missing one of their own who signed long-term, and Andrei Svechnikov, who is, a terrific scorer in his own right. Some say maybe they shouldn't do much of anything. You get Svechnikov healthy, you bring him back. If they do consider re-signing Pacioretty, who is now a UFA, maybe he stays, and maybe this team will have what it takes next year if everything goes right. They can still bring back most of the players, maybe make a few tweaks, and go at it again. Is that what they're going to do? Or will the Hurricanes be in the mix for some of this year's top guys? You have to think that the history suggests that they're going to try to make a big swing, that this team still has a lot of players under contract, but a lot of within the next 1 to 2 years, a lot of the contracts they have are going to be expiring. This team could certainly have could look different. It could certainly have a lot of, tough decisions to make. I think they're going to try to go for it this year while they have the most of their group together. Would not be shocked to see them go back to the Maple Leafs and try to pry William Nylander or Mitch Marner out of Toronto. I mean, they could certainly have some interesting pieces there that they could offer. I wouldn't be shocked if they offered a player like a Marty Necas, maybe a Brett Pesce. Like, obviously, Carolina, I think, is in a similar boat to a team like Toronto, or maybe they just need to change things up, change the DNA of that team just enough, a little bit here to give it a little bit different look to allow it to take it a step further. Maybe they could help each other in accomplishing those goals. Not to say that Necas is going to be the answer in Toronto, but that's probably the type of offer that Carolina would make in that regard. Now, of course, Pesce is a pretty solid right shot defenseman. Carolina does have a pretty strong decor, and they can afford to lose somebody back there. It may not necessarily be Pesce that they prefer to lose, of course, but still, at the end of the day, there is moves there that could be made. Could they talk to New Jersey? I mean, New Jersey is very much, considered to be unlikely by many, but we'll see if they prove us wrong, to sign Timo Meier and Jesper Bratt. Bratt has had some tough negotiations with the Devils. There's an argument, did Meier really fit in from San Jose this year after he was acquired? He didn't do the greatest, that's for sure. maybe they move one of them. I mean, one of those guys are available. That would fit Carolina quite well as well. So, would that make a lot of sense for the Hurricanes to focus on those guys? I think they're going to be trying their hardest. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but I think they're going to be looking for that blockbuster trade. And based on what we've seen from Rumours and talking about the Hurricanes here in the last few days since they've been eliminated, it's quite likely we're going to see it again. So let me know, if you're Carolina, which player do you try to make a blockbuster deal for? Do you think they need that top scoring forward to really change the top six here to push them over to have a better chance of getting to the Stanley Cup? Would you go for Meier, Bratt, Marner, Nylander? Who else in the NHL do you think would be the best fit for the Canes to target? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.